Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses, especially my fellow Pennsylvanian Josh Parsons from Lancaster County. At our last hearing about infrastructure, which was about a month ago, I noted that a group of my Republican colleagues and I had had a constructive discussion with President Biden about a potential bipartisan infrastructure package. I also noted three features of an infrastructure package that I think would have very broad bipartisan support. First, it should responsibly support real physical infrastructure. That is, the platforms and systems that we share and we use to move people's goods and services throughout the economy. It means things like roads and bridges and ports and airports. Second, a package cannot undo the 2017 tax reform that helped create the best economy of my lifetime. Remember, before COVID, we were experiencing an extraordinary economic boom. We had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. We had more job openings than people looking for jobs. We had a record low poverty rate and wage growth across the board, with wages growing fastest for the lowest income earners. That's exactly the economy we should all be wanting to get back to. And thirdly, we shouldn't pay for infrastructure by borrowing or printing billions of additional dollars. Now, good news in this is we have hundreds of billions of unspent COVID funds that Congress can repurpose. According to the Congressional Budget Office, over 700 billion of the Democrats' March spending bill won't be spent until after 2021. Now, unfortunately, the Biden administration wouldn't agree to these sensible features, and they walked away from negotiating with some of us. But I understand that there are bipartisan discussions underway. My hope is that an agreement can be reached that's consistent with these principles. But the scope and size of the administration's infrastructure plan as proposed at this point is simply untenable. I mean, take the scope of the plan. The administration wants to redefine what infrastructure means in order to spend taxpayer dollars on their Green New Deal agenda and other liberal policies. Consider some specific examples. The administration proposed almost $250 billion for housing. Now, set aside whether it's the responsibility of taxpayers to buy and build everyone a home, housing is not infrastructure. Housing is housing. The administration also proposed $100 billion in consumer rebates to purchase electric vehicles and $10 billion for the Civilian Climate Corps. This is not infrastructure. In addition to that, the $2.2 trillion size of the Biden administration plan is wildly excessive. Even the planned spending on the real physical infrastructure portion does not comport with economic reality, given how much money Congress has spent over the past year already. Take transit spending, for example. The administration wants $85 billion of additional money over the next 5 years, above and beyond what we would ordinarily spend over the next 5 years. Well, this doesn't take into account the tens of billions of dollars the federal government already provided for transit recently. This past March, our Democrat colleagues passed a bill spending $30 billion on transit. They did that after Congress provided more than $40 billion for transit in response to COVID in 2020. CBO estimates that of this $70 billion, $22 billion, almost a third of COVID transit dollars, won't be spent until after 2021. Oh, and the $70 billion, that was on top of the $13 billion we annually spend. So if you didn't have your calculator out, that's a total of $83 billion that Congress spent on transit over the course of 1 year. Amazingly enough, that number exceeds both the annual operating and capital costs of every single transit agency in the US combined. And now they want $85 billion more over the next 5 years on top of what we ordinarily spend. The administration seems to have lost sight of the fact that the federal role in infrastructure spending has historically been limited. State and local governments are primarily responsible for funding infrastructure projects for the obvious reason that most infrastructure projects are generally local or regional in nature. For example, a bus or a light rail station in San Francisco doesn't really do a lot for people in Pittsburgh. And states and local governments are currently awash with cash. In the aggregate, state and local tax collections set an all-time record in 2020. And in addition to record revenues over the course of 12 months, Congress sent more than $850 billion to state and local governments. So states are now trying to figure out ways to spend this huge windfall. California has a budget surplus of over $75 billion. And at this point, they just may send out free money to Californians. My home state of Pennsylvania is sitting on $3 billion revenue surplus plus $7 billion in unused federal money. So still more wasteful spending by Congress is not what our economy needs. It's already contributed to the harmful inflation Americans are experiencing right now. Inflation's at 5% right now, the highest it's been in 13 years, and this should not come as a surprise. Earlier this year, President Clinton's Treasury Secretary Larry Summers was warning us of the significant inflationary risks of the excessive spending, and that was before our Democratic colleagues passed the $1.9 trillion spending bill in March. But his warning was ignored, and now our Democratic colleagues want to spend hundreds of billions, maybe over $1 trillion more. Congress still has an opportunity to enact a sensible bipartisan infrastructure package, but that's only possible if we support real physical infrastructure that we pay for with existing funds without raising taxes or borrowing tens or hundreds of billions more. We can meet our country's infrastructure needs without jeopardizing our economic recovery and putting future generations of Americans further in debt. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.